All right, this morning we will be taking a look at 3:14 through verse 21, finishing up the third chapter, and I thought we would have an oral examination today so that we can discuss the various structures of that passage. If you were going to establish a controlling purpose statement for 3:14 through 21, what would it be? What would be your preliminary controlling purpose statement in 3:14 through 21? Okay, let's talk about it this way. What is Paul essentially talking about in 3:14 through 21? What has he been talking about in chapter 3?
Mystery revealed.
And mystery. What mystery? Remember now, this is from the Jewish perspective. They expected Messiah to come, establish the Davidic kingdom of Israel, enslave all the Gentiles or kill them, and they would rule and reign. The mystery is that God, in His mercy, made Gentiles who were outside the covenant, the commonwealth of Israel, separated by the old covenant. Remember that. We talked about last time. The Mosaic covenant put up a wall of separation. In order to follow God in the Old Testament, you had to become a follower of the Mosaic covenant, become a good Jew. The mystery here is that when Christ came, He included Gentiles, and that the new covenant brought full Gentile participation without them having to become Mosaic covenant people. They are new covenant people. The old covenant has been abrogated. The new covenant has been formed. Remember how we talked about Luther and Calvin discussing, is there any sanctifying purpose in the law? So here he's been showing that mystery from the perspective of Jews didn't expect this. And so he's been telling them that your full participation in the new covenant under Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, is something mysterious, and yet He finds it marvelous. Once again, when a person becomes born again, there is a love that God gives a born-again person for souls. This is why we have to be very careful how different elements can crop into Christian thinking, politics, or anything. A Christian should be separate from that and should see everyone who doesn't know Jesus as a soul that is precious and needs the gospel. This is how Paul is now reacting. That these are precious Gentiles whom he once wanted to slaughter, that needed salvation. And this is what he's talking about in 3:1 through 11, the mystery of Gentile inclusion. We didn't expect this. And so he goes to 3:14. And you must understand, how many of you have ever had a preacher read, able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we could ask or think? Remember that in 3:20 and 21? Do you now understand that that is not God can do, rub the magic lamp and a brand new Mercedes appears before the Christian, which many of these snake oil salesmen on TV do now. Do you know what that able to do above all that we can ask or think is? The marvelous nature of God's grace that included those whom they thought were reprobates worthy of hell. There is a wide mercy in God in Gentile inclusion that the Jews did not expect. Now let's ask ourselves a question. Christians, we're under the new covenant. Do we have that wide mercy to see all ethnic groups as precious and in need of salvation? I want you to respond to that.
I think if each of us are very honest with ourselves, we have to look in the mirror and really decide which groups we care less about than others and confront that sin and see all people as needing Christ, not people who are like me or people I'm comfortable with.
I think a way in which we have to be very careful is for the last how many years. Now, I'm thankful. You know what I'm thankful for? We get all of you precious guys from all over the world. That gives us truly a gospel perspective that the gospel needs to go into all the world. But I also know that for the past 11 years, America has been involved in war. And I think among evangelicals, I sense a lack of love and respect and sincere, I need to get the gospel to these precious people. When you look at Afghanistan, Iraq, do we have a love for those souls? It's awful quiet in here right now. It worries me that we often get caught up in national politics as Christians, and when we need to realize that every one of those people that our government may be in conflict with, we cannot as Christians, or we've become just like Paul was before he was saved. Now, I know I can get in trouble here, but I've seen many churches get caught up in this. We love the Jewish people, don't we? Don't we? But what about those precious Middle Eastern peoples? I see many churches where they get so caught up in this politics that they lose perspective that those precious souls in all of these areas, they're precious souls that need the Lord. Or do you think I'm not perceiving it correctly among evangelical churches? What do you think?
I think it's so much so that as we abide in Christ, and you'll see it in churches or different groups where there might be some sort of resentment or racism or whatever it is, but then when you get a missionary from that people group or whatever that comes and shares about those people and their hearts are pricked and there's repentance and you see.
I don't know if it's so much racism, but it worries me nationalism. That little old lady that complained, got an email yesterday that we didn't sing on 4th of July, Battle Hymn of the Republic and things like that. And you laugh, but she thought it was terrible that my church didn't have, and I thought, well, wait a second. We have to be careful because Christians, it says, in 2 Corinthians, we beg people to come to Jesus. We need to have a hunger and a thirst and a love for lost souls, even Canadians. Rod?
It's interesting, back home I've got a lot of friends who are Lebanese, Palestinian, Egyptian and so forth, and the same perspective that Americans have for Middle Easterners, they have for Jews. And so I'm just sitting there scratching my head, the fact that they hate Jews, yet they're Christians and they know of Christ. So it's exactly the same in other cultures as well and with other people.
But Christians should be, and I'm not saying you're not saying it, but Christians need to be different. We need to see every soul. Next time you see someone going, Allah Akbar, and all of this, remember now, Jesus died for that soul. Didn't say it was easy evangelism, but he died for that soul. So when we look at this is the practical nature of Ephesians. I can tell you all about the grammar, but I often want to keep the big picture. That in 1 through 3, the call of the church is an amazing story of the church was, in the old covenant, those lost Gentiles separated, and now through Jesus brought near. And every time you see groups of people, keep Jesus' perspective of the love and the salvation that he offers. And keep out of the politics as Christians. Just preach the word. All right, let's go into this. Do you have in light of that, do you have a controlling purpose statement now? Please feel free to look at the English too. I know that's heretical in a lot of Greek classes, but some of you may struggle. Look at the Greek. What do you think? Paul is praying again here, isn't he, in verse 16? To understand what?
The love of Christ.
To understand the love of Christ so that you can be what? Rooted and grounded in what? Oh, there you go. See, there you go, fundamentalist. Love is vital. Paul said, if I don't have love, what am I? He's talking about this being rooted and grounded in love in light of the terrible... Do you know in the Jewish temple, if you were a Gentile and got into an area where Gentiles weren't supposed to go, what they could do to you? What? They could stone you, kill you. That hostility is gone. At least in the Bible, I'm not so sure. I think there are Christian groups that resurrect this kind of hostility. It says, being rooted and grounded in love, in order that you should know the depth of what? Know the depth of what in 18 and 19? All right, now we haven't gotten there yet, but think about this when we do get there. Is that your love for Christ or Christ's love for you? Subjective or objective genitive? Then he prays, able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we could ask or think. You know what that says? Jews had no idea that the love of God was broad enough to encompass heathen, unsaved goy. God's love is marvelous to include the excluded. Let's keep that in mind in our evangelism. Okay, let's take a look. Verse 14. Who can tell me, who would be willing to take a look at verse 14 and analyze what they can, and we'll listen? Nathan.
You want me to give you a translation?
No, I want you to take every Greek word and tell me how it's functioning. I really don't care. You can give me at first a translation if you want, but I want to analyze every Greek word as to everything you can tell me. Go ahead.
For this reason, I bow my knee before the Father.
What would that be your first signal of in a controlling purpose statement? If he bows his knee, figuratively speaking, what's in his mind? Begins with a P. Of? Most likely thanksgiving. Okay, go ahead, Nathan. 2:2.
2:2 is this.
How is it functioning in this sentence, Nathan? How is 2:2 in verse 14 functioning?
It's modifying, is it modifying current?
No, actually it's the exact opposite. Listen to me now. Corinne, and I set you up, so don't worry about it. I didn't know these things too when I was, in seminary. I mean, I had to learn these things later. Corinne is an improper preposition. Who could tell me what an improper preposition is?
Doesn't have an object?
No, an improper preposition. He's wealthy now. He knows that I can't do anything about him now. An improper preposition is a word that is not appended to verbs or other nouns to form a compound word. You'll never see Corinne Luo. Do you guys remember Luo from... Did that Joe Divilbush just all of a sudden, I remember. I mean, he's having post-traumatic stress disorder from Gladiator Greek. Well, there were many, like epiluo, kataluo. What does read mean in Greek? Analuo. Oh, anaginosko, excuse me, I'm sorry. To know up. So we see that ana and others were appended to verbs or other nouns to make words, compound words. You'll never see Corinne appended. Therefore, they call them improper. And please note, with improper prepositions, the object of the prep comes before. So 2:2 is what? Object of the preposition. On account of this. All right, now here's a question. Remember now, we have to interrogate the text. This is what commentators do. They're asking who, what, why, how, where, when. And they're asking these questions of the text they come across on account of this. Now you have to become, when we read stuff, we're so used to things that we don't really start thinking. Nathan, on account of this, what would that imply? On account of this, what would you start thinking of when it says on account of this?
Referencing back to the previous context.
Okay, and then you'd have to decide where in the previous context he's picking up the thought from. So what do you think? Just talk it through logically. What are some of the options as we look at who, what, when, where, why, how? On account of this, on account of what is what my basic question. And a commentary, let me just show you. If Justin would open up his commentary, and let's see how our commentary talks about this for a second. Now, I don't want to be exegeting commentaries, but you've got to start thinking like someone who has written a commentary in your own exegesis. So what does our commentator say about this phrase? Nathan? I'll let Nathan read it, give it a couple times. On account of this. On account of this. This what? And then don't forget, sometimes commentators will leave us completely without any information. Many times commentaries affirm the obvious and run away from what is really the hard problems of the passage. Nathan, what does he say?
Page 472. For this reason, this marks the resumption of the sentence begun in verse 1, which was interrupted by the long digression of verses 2 through 13.
Look what he's done. Now, this is why I want to bring this up. This is very important. Look what he's done. He's looked at 2:2 Corinne, and then he discovered by looking at the context 3:1, and what's the same about 3:1 and 3:14? Huh? Same phrase on account of this. What Paul has done, Paul was emotional. Paul was an emotional guy. And he got so caught up in what he was doing that he would when he wrote, he started getting so excited, thrilled, or just stunned by Gentile inclusion in the people of God that he literally, for the first 14 verses, kind of went off on, and then has to pick himself back up in 3:14 to continue. How do you like that? You want to see when Paul's angry? Go to Galatians. So he picks up his thought. So most likely, in this, it's fairly obvious, we got to be careful about that on account of this goes back to what, Nathan?
1 and 2, but 2 specifically before chapter
3:1 through 14. Or 3:1 through 13, excuse me. Okay, continue on. On account of this campto.
I bound, a present indicative active first singular, so it's a continuous.
All right, now let's ask ourselves that question. This is present indicative. And Nathan said he believes it's the habitual linear durative nature of the present should be talked about. Now let's remember back. Remember, we have to be careful because it's in the indicative mood that time becomes a factor. Now, time is not the most important thing in Greek tense aspect. Kind of action. Aspect is the most important. Do you remember this? We had kind of action and kind of time in the indicative. Remember? And we said, and we gave you 4. There are more, but we gave you 4. And none of these work. And we said that there was first the progressive present. Who can remember these? Come on. Huh? Iterative. Come on, this is review. Customary. Huh? Tendential. Sometimes these are known by different names. Then we said these, if we conclude it's one of these, we can play up the kind of action. On the other side, what did we put over here that we'd say we'd have to be careful? Huh? Well, that's heuristic, means there are some Greek verbs. Can you name some Greek verbs that are heuristic just by their very meaning? They're very lexicosemantic, their morphological meaning. Can you remember some of those on the list? What? Fami. Yaomai. Amy. Huh? Histemi? I don't. Come on. Who's got those notes? How about aphiemi? I forgive. Remember these? Huh? By their very nature. How do you find out what verbs by their very nature may not have an habitual linear durative type of thing? You look at a good dictionary. By the way, BDAG, Bauer, died this last week. He died. So BDAG, and you guys misinformed me one time. It's not D-bag. I was right. It's BDAG. You guys sit there, no, it's D-bag, you idiot professor. And I just fold. Okay, I'll go along with it. It's BDAG. That's what they said in the article I read about his death anyway. So, you look for a good dictionary. What are the other 3? This is good. This is why we do this review. What are the other 3? Okay, historic. Huh? What? Nomic. Begins with an F. Okay. Now, these are in your notes from last semester. Now let's get the big picture here. This you only have to worry about whether you play up the action in the indicative mood. Why the indicative mood? Because it's the only place where time becomes a factor directly to influence the aspect. You don't have to do this in the subjunctive. You don't have to do this in the optative, imperative, or the participle in the infinitive. But here, this is the only place where time occurs, yes? So this is where you would have to be careful. What you don't want to do is habitual linear durative always say habitual linear durative in the present. Did you just get what I said? You don't say habitual linear durative, it's habitual linear durative. You've got to, in the indicative mood, be careful and remember this. So that we don't make mistakes in the present indicative. All right. Any questions? Now, how would you classify Campto? On account of this, back to the previous verses, 3:1 through 13, I Campto. What does Campto mean? Okay, I bow. What kind of present indicative do you think this is? Well, if it's customary, would it be his habit over a period of time? So you're saying it has some type of habitual nature. Well, let's look at, huh? I was thinking iterative or customary. Okay, well, they're very close. Iterative will become customary over time. But let's think about the nature of the verbal idea, I bow. If you said it was habitual linear durative, what could be being indicated by that if you do that?
It's a habit rather than a response. Would you say that? So it's mechanical rather than, what was that reading?
I habitually bow.
There's a time when he's not bowing.
No, I habitually bow. Does that make good sense in the passage that he habitually bows his knee? Let's ask what our writer, does he give any comment on our commentary on the kind of present he sees here? It's my habit to bow my knee. Does he say anything about Campto?
He talks about the semantics of the word.
Okay, read that about the semantics of the word. Read it.
The word Campto is used only 4 times in the New Testament. In Romans 11:4, Paul quotes 1 Kings 19:18, where God tells Elijah that 7,000 men have not bowed the knee to Baal. Paul quotes again where God declares that he alone is God and every knee will bow and every tongue give praise to him. Paul states that God has highly exalted Christ and every name of Jesus. At the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow, whether in heaven or on earth.
Okay, that's a future, but we have a present. Keep going.
In the present context, Paul prostrates himself before God, who is called Father, in order to petition him in prayer. In 3:12, Paul mentioned that all believers have access to God, and here he exemplifies this. The word kampto to gonata mu are a metonymy of adjuncts, adjunct simply meaning I pray. There are ample examples in the scriptures of varied postures of prayer, on one's knees as well as lying prostrate.
So let's ask this. Does he mean I am habitually bowing? Or does it mean eristically, figuratively, as a principle, nomic? But it's not a pithy saying, but I bow my knee when I think about this. Is it being literally, he's literally, progressively, habitually, or is it more figurative sense so it would lose its habitual linear durative nature?
If it's a figure of, if bowing the knee is a figure of speech for prayer.
Okay, so if it's a figure of speech, does it become atemporal? No time. I bow my knee. He's not trying to paint the picture of a habitual action or more like a timeless truth, a principle. And has the aspect been subsumed under a timeless truth, so it's lost some of its, or it's lost its habitual sense? What do you think? This is how you have to think about tense. Would you as a preacher say Paul's always bowing his knee before the Lord when he thinks about this?
No, but I would say he's regularly praying for them.
But is that what this means? He's not talking about regularly praying for them. He's talking about when he thinks about how God loved the unloved, that it causes him to thank God for his great mercy, the love of Christ. So is this something that he's saying, have the habit of prayer, or is he saying this is a principle with him and it's gone beyond time? Just think about it for a while.
It sounds like a principle because he says metonymy of adjunct, simply meaning I'm praying for you. Not necessarily that he's bowing his knee, it's euphemistic.
Okay.
He's praying.
So the euphemism, the figure of speech, could that cause it not to, so you wouldn't play up the aspect at this point?
I don't think the point of the passage is how often he's praying, or even his posture is what is causing him to respond in prayer. The content of the gospel, the content of the...
So would you use this verse to talk about habit of prayer?
No.
See, what I don't want you guys to do is this. Once you learn that present is habitual, aorist is undefined, and all of that, you begin to mechanically, unthinkingly, without analyzing, applying these principles. Because it will get rather trite if you do. So tell me, what do you think? Is this, which side do you think this should be on in your exegetical decision? Which side?
Wouldn't it be more principle because he says for this reason? It's just his response.
I think the figurative nature of his expression makes me cautious on wanting to say that Paul is genuflecting habitual linear durative, kind of mechanically applying that idea, or not.
I think it's also helpful to note that in Ephesians 1, when he says he prays for them, he says, having heard of your faith, I don't cease giving thanks for you. So oftentimes when he wants to emphasize the frequency, he'll say, I haven't stopped praying for you. I unceasingly pray for you. But here he doesn't say that. So I would lean towards not playing up the...
So when you get into figures of speech, you have to all of a sudden be careful. As Eric Weathers has pointed out, if this is, you were, right, Eric? This is a figure of speech, didn't you say that? I want to credit you if you did. Okay. Then that makes you say, now, do I want to mechanically, constantly apply habitual linear durative? You don't. You see this on the board? When it comes to the present indicative, that is where time is, and you have to be careful that you don't habitual linear durative apply habitual linear durative to every present tense. Am I beating a dead horse here, or are you guys seeing this? Repetition is what? What's the key to learning?
Repetition.
All right, thank you. See how things stick in your head after a while? Let's go on. On account of this, I bow my knees. How would you see my knees? How is the move?
It's part of Paul's, which would mean that's part of his, it's part of his.
Well, Partitive, what's the difference? What did our grammar say about how you tell the partitive from the possessive genitive? Who can remember this? Who will find for me, how do you tell the partitive genitive from the possessive genitive? There's a question you ask yourself. Huh? If you took and said, I have the cat's tail, what would happen with that cat? He would object to you having his tail. If I said, I have the bumper of the car, what would that? That car's not going to object. So find that principle and look at it. My knees. So what does that make my knees? Possessive. It's a simple answer, but I want you to remember that principle. Does the thing or person object? Please read it. Page 84 of our grammar.
This is the use of the genitive is similar to one kind of possessive genitive, with one significant difference. The tail of the dog is possessive, while the bumper of the car is partitive. As can be seen, the difference between these two has to do with animatus. One crude way to test whether the genitive is partitive or possessive is to ask whether the genitive, substantive, would object to the head noun's departure. A dog would, a car would not.
Okay, so how many remember that principle? Please have the camera pan around that we're getting almost no response right now. This is why we do a review. How many remember that? Raise your hand. You say, preacher, I remember that. How many will be honest and say, preacher, I don't remember that. I was not awake when you did that. You should have woken me up during your lecture last semester. That's why I have this review. Okay, my knees. How do you see proston patera? Nathan.
It's a prepositional phrase.
What are the two forces of a prepositional phrase?
Adverbial and adjectival.
So what do we have here? I bow my knees towards the Father. Probably adverbial. All right, who would volunteer for 15? Mr. Stuckey, you're looking at me like you're trying to communicate, I will do it, but I will not raise my hand. You have to force me a little bit, but I'm leaning the way that I think I'll do it, but force me. Is this what you're saying to me? Am I picking up this message? All right. 15.
From whom every family in heaven and on the earth is called.
Okay.
Or gets its name.
X is what?
Is a preposition.
Can you tell me why in this preposition? Please note, gentlemen, there could have been two ways that this preposition could have looked, in theory anyway. Ek, who, and it's got here X, who. And as we look at this, who can tell me why the preposition ek has taken on the X instead of ek? Who can tell me?
It's because of the breathing.
Rough breathing. So, from whom, Mark? What is who? What is the who there? What is that word?
Relative pronoun.
It's a relative pronoun. So, here, who does it refer to and how do you know that? Who does it refer to and how do you know that? It's called the rule of concord, at least in this prepositional phrase. It takes its case from the preposition ek, right? Genitive. But its number and gender tell you something. What? What's its antecedent? Patera. From whom? From the Father. Pasa patria. What's that? How's that functioning? How is that pasa patria? How is that functioning there in this sentence? Okay, it's anybody else? How is pasa patria all lineage?
subject is Arnamadzitai.
It's the subject. Very good. It's the subject of Anamadzatai, from whom, the father, all lineage is being named. All right, let's go to Mark, Anamadzatai. Parse it for me.
Present, middle, indicative, third singular.
You said it's middle. Names itself. Or is it passive, is being named? Now, remember now, do you remember this in Gladiator Greek there? Joe Divil, as soon as I say that, Diviblis wakes up again and gets post-traumatic stress. Now I forgot what I was going to say, which is not unusual for me. Middle or passive, remember in Gladiator, the present, the imperfect, the perfect and the pluperfect, in terms of general forms, doesn't have a distinct middle or a distinct passive ending. The future and the aorist do. So here, it's either one or the other. You can't tell. So how would you determine on Anamadzatai how you would see this? What would you bring in? Mark, is there anything you can bring in on Anamadzatai about whether it's middle or passive? What could you do in this to figure that out? Well, the first thing I would do is try to translate it into English in the middle and in the passive and see which seems to make sense. What else could you do? Well, you could consult a good dictionary. See what the dictionary says. So what do you think, guys? Let's talk about this. Is it all lineage or fatherhood names itself? Or is being named?
I think it's passive.
Why?
Just within the context, if it's middle, then having X who really doesn't fit into the sentence.
Scotty?
I want the father, what he's doing.
Did you?
Talking about what the father is doing to the fingers.
Well, who's naming? It's a passive. If it's passive, who's doing the naming?
Father.
If it's middle, who's doing the naming? Okay. Let's ask another question. And again, you're not going to solve all of these things as we meditate on this passage. This is what tense did you say? What aspect did you say, Mark? No, aspect. That's voice.
Indicative,
That's mood.
That's
What aspect is this? All right, here we go again. We look up at the board and we say the present. We don't want to make a knee jerk. What's a knee jerk? Doc, what's a knee jerk?
Spinal reflex.
What's a reflex then?
It's when you hit something and then
But it's below the conscious level.
It goes into your spinal cord and it's a closed circuit. So what happens is you hit the kneecap. It activates a nerve that goes into your spinal cord, and the nerve gets activated back to activate one.
Well, we got the medical, but what we wanted to say was it's a non-thinking response. Yes.
Yes.
When you
It
used to
doesn't go
give
your
physical.
brain, it's below the conscious level.
So name some of the processes that are below the conscious level.
Name some
Yeah.
breathing, your heartbeat, your kidney functions, your GI tract functions.
Okay.
You don't have to think about those things.
Okay. It's not on the conscious level. So what I'm trying to prevent here is this. If I said I'm trying to prevent you from having a knee-jerk response on the present, What am I trying to prevent you from doing? An automatic what? Unthinking response. Now here's what happens in Gladiator Greek. We told you, for those of you that suffered with me in Gladiator Greek, remember we told you the present tense is habitual linear durative, all that, and then what can happen is a knee-jerk response of exegesis. So what would I be meaning by saying a knee-jerk response in exegesis regarding the present tense? What would I be saying? You always, Jeremy says, you always would see it. That's what we've got to be careful. We do not want to do that. As we mature in exegesis, we find, yes, present tense often convey that, but they don't always. So how do you see this present tense here? I'll make it subjective. I'll make it existential. How do you see this present tense? How are you going to handle it? Remember now, it's in the present indicative that this becomes a problem because time is a factor. How are you going to handle this? How do you think this present should be handled? Should it be the left column of all the habitual linear durative ideas, or should it be the right column? I better not play up the habitual linear durative aspect, even if it is present indicative. Think it through. Justin.
Even if it is habitual linear durative, do you have to play it up?
Not always. But remember now, thank you for, he said, would you say that again, Justin, because this is what we have to, once again, remember. Say that again.
Just because it is habitual linear durative, do you have to play it up? Does it always call attention to itself?
Now remember, when we get into more of exegesis in just a little bit, and I think I will start next week into our exegetical lecture, let you guys review on your own. Remember, the flow of exegesis, the flow of the sermon is this. It assumes that you've had the biblical languages. It assumes that you know your hermeneutics. Have you guys had hermeneutics? It assumes that you know something about the New Testament introduction material regarding Ephesians. Have you got your papers going yet? Let the cameras pan around and look at the... You ever see a deer caught in the headlights? When's it due? What? Okay. Here, you've got that all done. Okay, then you get to exegesis. Exegesis is detailed technical. We're dealing with a lot of technical areas. Aspect, case, construction, clauses, purpose, result. Trying to analyze all of this. Then, Justin said, would I always play it up? Well, when you're moving up. You don't go down. If you impose this down, you're eisegeting, you're imposing your thoughts upon the text. You want the text to speak for itself. So in exposition, this is where we don't teach in this class we don't teach, there's this block here, but you're going to have to make the decision, Justin, as to whether you feel the point should be brought up and how it will contribute to conveying to your people the importance of the passage. So that's a judgment call. Anytime you're in exposition, you have to use your skill and wisdom as an exegete, and then you filter out a lot of this, because can you imagine if you preached every little thing here? How many of you find this tedious to go word for word and ask all these questions? How many of you feel that it's tedious? Well, if you feel it's tedious and you do that to your congregation, what do you think they're going to feel? They're going to feel like throwing you out. So the answer is, would you always? It better be a pretty good point. as to whether this present passive you'd want to spend a lot of time on. You may want to spend a lot of time on the general idea that, hey, in the biblical framework, God is Father of all. There are only two daddies in this world, and you know them by their actions. God is Father of all, but by how you act, Satan could be, there's where you could have this opportunity to go into that. So, does that answer your question? So look, when you become the guide, exegete is a guide. You're the Lewis and Clark. You're taking them to another area. You have to make the decision over what path they follow. Teachers have the greater judgment. So how many of you would think I'd play up okay, first, let's decide this. Do we play up the habitual linear durative, or do we play up the heuristic idea of this present tense?
Could there be a third category where we don't play up anything?
You just ignore it, in other words.
Well, I mean, if somebody writes me a letter, I don't sit and say, well, that was present tense, I mean, to get at the thrust of the idea, the thrust of the prayer, could we just move on and say that he bowed his knee?
That would be a judgment call, wouldn't it?
Right.
So that's the third alternative. I'm just going to ignore the usage of the present tense, right? Right?
Sure.
Well, I guess that would depend upon your philosophy of preaching. But I know one thing, if you play up everything and anything, and you do it enough, how many of you guys, when you hear a speaker, have heard guys get into the real details of this type of a passage, and do you enjoy it? Some may. The vast majority probably won't. It's a judgment call, Justin.
Yeah, I wasn't saying ignore it, I was just saying move to, that doesn't
It's not a main point, right? It's not a main point. See, the thing about preaching is this. It's an art as well as a science, guys. And exegesis is an art as well as a science. There is no formula that you can put in to discover what should I bring out in this passage and how should I bring it out. Once you've done the exegesis, that filtering line has to be something that you need to think about. So let's ask, do we want to play up? How do we see this present who is being named? What do you want to do with this present? Do we have habitual linear durative or do we not? How do we see this present tense? This is very important, not the knee-jerk, the present tense.
Doesn't onomazo fit under the aoristic, a one-time name, you only name once? Would it fit under the aoristic more so?
Honestly, on that one, I'm not sure. It's not on the list. You'd have to get a good dictionary. Who is being named? True for all time? Okay. Andre?
What is the distinction between nomic and aorist?
Heuristic and nomic? Heuristic, in its very verbal idea, it doesn't have habitual linear durative. Nomic means it's so true of all time that it goes beyond time. It's like an apothegm, a pithy saying. It's true for all time. So one, it doesn't have any aspect in it. It's defective in its aspect. The other is it's gone to like so general of a principle that it loses any connotation of habitual linear durative. Anybody?
Even in the context of encompassing all.
Okay.
All of the things.
Let's ask what our commentator, who can find out if our commentary will help us after we've kind of put out our ideas. Will our commentator give us his learned opinion on it? Anybody have it? What's he say?
He gives a pretty lengthy passage, but he summarizes by saying, to summarize, God the Father is the one who creates and thus names every family in heaven and on earth. He is a God who is alive and acting in the present time, rather than a God who has died and is no longer active in history.
None of those comments actually apply directly to the issue.
The present tense of the verb would seem to indicate that God is still naming every family because.
So how, if he says that, how is our commentator taking that? Habitual. He's not saying it's nomic. He's saying it's actually on the left. Habitual. Any family that occurs, God is naming it. What do you think? What makes more sense?
It makes sense that people are still being saved or still being named part of God's family. I mean, there's a point in time in which I can be part of the family of God.
Okay, let's move on. I'm not going to solve it. I'm going to leave you with the questions, the issues, and welcome to my world of being driven to insanity at times. Andre, did you want to interrogate, give an interrogative? Because we don't hear much declaration from our dear Russian brethren. Go ahead.
Well, I was actually second thought about the previous thing that we talked about. Just the pronoun who, you wrote the pronoun there. You said that it was in concord with patera.
What now?
Second order 15, whom, you said that it was in concord with patera?
Yes, it's singular masculine, and so is patera. No, the genitive can vary depending on how it's used in the sentence. Now, I have a question for you that nobody noticed. Do you notice something about this question? And I do it just to have a little bit of a discussion. No, it's a more obvious question. It says this, what families are being named? Where are these families? What? All you guys were mentioning is earthly families. So who are these heavenly families?
Celestial planet.
What's in his water that he brings that big water jug every day? Listen to me. What families? What are the family categories here? Heavenly and earthly. Somebody help me handle this. What does this mean? Heavenly families. This is why we freshly look at the text, gentlemen. I'm not going with our Mormon brother Justin here. But have you thought about that? This is called looking at afresh at the text. And what we did was no one in your habitual little, here's what we do. We frame it and we keep in this narrow confine. All of you were earthly. None of you brought up, well, wait a second. It says heavenly families. In the heavenlies and upon the earth. So in the heavenlies refers to all, no wait, from whom all, what's patria? Families in the heavens and upon the earth. Well, it's in the heavens and we live on the surface of the earth. So please tell me, what is this? In the heavenlies. No.
Could patria be more general people?
What people in the heavens?
Angels?
Doesn't Patria have the idea of fatherhood? So everyone who is born of God, who is from God, who God makes, so angels, heavenly hosts, just the general.
Rod's looking at me. How many did this cross your mind when this came up? Huh? Joe woke up.
It makes me think of, because in verse 1, he talks about, for the sake of the Gentiles and his stewardship of God's grace to his ministry to the Gentiles. And it makes me think of the families, the races, the nations of the Gentiles. That
Yes, but this says in the heavenlies. Doesn't it? So, and then it says upon the earth, so clearly, Jack McDonald.
Could just be families that have died and are now in heaven, and families that are currently now on the earth.
Well, okay.
It couldn't also just be emphatically saying, there's not a group that's missed.
Yeah.
I think.
So what Steve is saying is, what he's being is saying, if there is a family anywhere, he's not saying there are per se heavenly, in the heavens families, but if there are, God is the author of all of them.
I mean, I don't think it has to do with angels and demons. The point is taking Israel and everyone else.
Well, why don't you think it says in the heavenlies? Let's be careful.
I think the reason why, Professor, is because in the context that he's talking about Israel and everyone else coming together. And now the point is saying, look, God is God of Israel and everyone else. And that means everyone else, wherever they're at.
Which would imply what?
The space aliens.
No, I'm not talking.
These demons.
I just want you to, this is how I do this every year to get guys to stop. And we often tacitly are assuming things without looking at it and gripping it. Let's see what our commentator says of the in the heavenlies. Find out what he says.
He uses the context of verse 10, through the church the manifold wisdom of God might be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places.
Who are these rulers and authorities?
Because of the context, some restrict the family only to the redeemed, and those of the family in heaven may refer to departed Christians.
Okay, so there, somebody came up with, they may be, but they're still earthly families, but they've gone to heaven. So they're still stuck upon the earth idea.
And it says, however, in keeping with the preceding context, verse 10, it is more likely has a reference to the angelic being.
So it refers to, most likely, to angelic beings. And God is the Father of all of those angelic beings. How many have thought about that when they came across this verse before? How many didn't think of it? This is what I mean by in exegesis, you've got to kind of fresh your mind so that you come to grips with every word. Why is that here? Who is this referring? So the question here is, who is this referring to? I don't think it has to get too complex, because clearly in... Who read this? Robert, did you read that? As Robert read that, the context is heavenly, heavily, not heavenly, on angelic, on the angelic realm. So what do you think? Any final comments before we move to the next verse?
I think if it does include angels, it kind of knocks out the habitual linear derivative idea. Because I was thinking...
Are you disagreeing with the commentary? Are you disagreeing with the commentary? Do you have the audacity to tell me you are disagreeing with the commentary? Are you disagreeing with the commentary? Huh? Are you or are you not? Huh?
Yes.
Good. Because that's another thing. Remember, what are commentaries? There are checks and learned opinions, but when it gets up into the pulpit and you start preaching, you cannot say to the Lord, well, Lord, that's what the commentary said, so I went with it. Guess who's responsible in the pulpit when you preach? James 3:1, do not many of you become teachers, beloved brethren, because they will have the stricter judgment. Why? We all use our tongues, don't we? And Paul said the most powerful, or James said the most powerful weapon in the world is not nuclear weapons. It's our tongues. And the reason why we have war today is not because of anything but political tongues that wagged and people are dying. Tongue is a fire. You're responsible for that. So make your decision. Now, it's a learned opinion. Don't disrespect it. Verse 16. Who would volunteer? Well, it's just so enthusiastic. I mean, I don't know who to pick because you're all raising your hand. Nathan? You did it again. Thanks, Nathan. You shouldn't be punished twice in a day like that, you know? Who's got it? Jeremy? Did you do this? Did you do That's what Southern boys do when they know they're in trouble and about what you talking about? You want to do it? Sure. Okay. Hina. What is hina?
It is a resultative conjunction.
Well, it's a subordinating conjunction.
That's what I mean.
It introduces a clause that can't stand alone in a sentence. What mood is usually followed? Subjunctive mood usually follows hina. What are some of the functions of hina, and where would I find that?
In the grammar.
Who could show me where the prepositions in our grammar are discussed? In Romans, you should pay heavy attention to prepositions because they show Paul's line of thinking very strategically. Okay, what's it say there?
Well, that's where it begins the discussion.
On discussion on what?
Conjunctions.
Conjunctions are on page 667. Does our summary sheet have a summary? You know, remember you were to do this last semester? Does our summary sheet have an area where conjunctions are used?
Yeah, on 741.
On 741. I know this is probably, for some of you, simplistic. For others of you, I'll bet you if I said, who has never looked at the conjunctions? 761. How many of you ever looked at the conjunctions in this abbreviated handbook? Raise your hand. Huh? Here on page 761. How many have ever looked at it? How many say to me in front of all the DVD cameras, preacher, I didn't know that was in there? Raise your hand, please. Let's be honest. Let's be honest. Thank you. I see those hands. Thank you. Thank you. See that hand. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's why I bring this stuff up. That's why we do these oral quizzes, so that you become aware of the resources that you have. Can you imagine the resources we have today with the Bible programs and all of this? What wonderful resources we have. So, hina, Jeremy, how can the hina function here? Tell me about the, is hina in here clearly? Tell me where you find hina in this list on 761. 762? What do you see?
Let's see. For this reason, I bow my knees so that he might give to you.
No, I just meant on page 760. Can you find on page 761 and 762 where hina is said to have a function?
Yeah, I would say purpose.
And where else can it have a function on this?
Result.
Where else is hina mentioned in this list?
Result and
Where is exegetical?
3B.
Exegetical is further qualifying, clearing by completing the thought or further defining it. That, something like that. So how do we see this, Jeremy? How would you see this Hina here. Hina, how is it functioning?
I would say purpose.
It's giving the purpose of what?
The purpose of him bowing his knee to the Father.
The purpose of prayer here is, what does he want the Ephesians to know?
That he might give to you according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened in the Spirit, in the inner man.
In order that he should give to you. Give what? How is parse do, please, for me? Do!
It is aorist, subjunctive, active, third singular.
Okay, let's be notational here. It's aorist. Let's talk about the aorist now. Here's another one that's been abused. Tell me about the aorist, Jeremy.
Punctiliar.
He knows how to hurt a guy, you know what I mean? We never call the aorist, never always. Those are two words you never always use in language, but for the aorist, we want to emphasize that we don't want to label it like Weist and some of the people who overplayed it. The aorist here is what, Jeremy?
It looks at the action as a whole. It's undefined.
Undefined. Action as accomplished without saying how it was accomplished. Now, if you said it was punctiliar here, what would that imply? Point, action, punctiliar. That he should give to you, point, action, punctiliar what? And how many of you know that your wisdom is completely, the moment you asked, your wisdom is completely 100% fully there without any need to ask again? Huh? We know that's not true. So the guys that would say the aorist here is punctiliar would be saying that they have this understanding, instant, once for all, point, action. Would that make sense? What it is saying is, he's not commenting on how long it takes or the way in which God gives it to you, but that God would give you to you an understanding of God's love and grace in including you, Gentiles. Don't forget, when this was written, it was from the perspective of the church had been mostly Jewish, huh? It was rapidly becoming Gentile, which was mysterious even to believing Jews. You need to understand what God has done for you, your spiritual blessing that He'd give to you. A developed understanding of how Christ loves you, just like He did us Jews. Should give to you. Okay, who's the Haman, Jeremy?
Those he's writing to, the Ephesians.
The Ephesians? Okay. Well, we're out of time this morning. We need to continue doing this. I'd like to spend just the whole semester interrogating the text like this. We do this on occasion so that we can get you guys familiar with asking questions as you translate. And when you start to do this well, you actually can anticipate what the commentaries are going to try to address when you do this. We'll continue to do it more.